Welcome. This is our next talk about the CARR Roundtable, an initiative to bring together regulators to talk about generic issues in regulation, together with academics who are doing research at CARR. The last meeting was about emerging risks and how to detect them and how to handle them. To talk about this, we welcome here Alex Griffiths from the CARR Quality Commission, but who also does research in basically risks in higher education. So in that sense has many a different view on this. Alex, I mean, why do you think these emerging risks are so troubling, in particular finding out where they're coming from?
Well, I think it's fair to say that firstly all kind of regulators, I'm sure fellow forum attendees would agree, that have more to do than time or resources permit. So additional risks kind of on top of that, on top of the ones we're responsible for managing, kind of pose real challenges. So I think the important thing is for us is to make sure that we can identify these risks before they become issues and have systems in place to deal with those. In terms of where they kind of come from, I think the forum's kind of identified three areas broadly. So we've kind of got a technological or scientific risks that can come about. So if you think of modern examples, we have things like driverless cars that are coming in that might not fit into legislative frameworks. We have behavioural changes, and those can come from us regulators ourselves, or it can come from people kind of we're responsible for overseeing. And we also have legislative changes or political changes that kind of come in from our political masters. And so if we take the higher education as an example, we recently had a kind of legislative change that meant there was a lot more loans being made available to students at private providers, which meant there was a £500 million kind of budget hole, which had to be made up by the higher education sector, which meant out of nowhere there was suddenly kind of a very large new finance and quality risk that came about.
So technologies, new stuff, new usage, new types of business activities. But what do you think is particularly difficult, apart from the lack of resources, for regulators to deal with these sort of emerging risks?
So I think, well, first and foremost, I say we have these kind of systems in place. We have known risks that we're set up to deal with, and those hopefully work very well, dealing with those established risks. But they're not necessarily adaptable to these kind of new and emerging risks, kind of by definition. That we're not set up to deal with them. So it can be something very simple. It could be the fact that if a new risk emerges at one end of the country, we might not have the staff necessary to deal with it, or they might not be trained in the right way to deal with it, or we might not have the legislative backing to deal with it as it's come about in a relatively new way. So we might not have the ability to kind of detect it in the first place, or deter people from undertaking these risks. I think there's also, as with all kind of emerging risks, by definition they're emerging. We might simply not have the expertise or the understanding. So if you think a recent example might be the Civil Aviation Authority and the ability of ash clouds to do damage to plane engines, or the kind of 2010 flash crash in the Dow Jones Index. The regulator could only measure information to the nearest second, when the problem was trades going on in nanoseconds. I think there's also a kind of third issue that the forum's uncovered, in that regulation's never quite so simple. We have a broad regime with a number of actors with kind of overlaps and underlaps. And when a new risk emerges, we need to know how best to deal with it and who's responsible for dealing with it and acting together. So there's a number of challenges that come about with these emerging risks that we need to be on top of.
And do you think, partly drawing on our discussions at the forum, were there some examples you thought were sort of interesting, or which might go down as smart practice, or might be labelled otherwise as interesting?
Well, I think that it was certainly a very nice example that came about, that there was one smaller regulator thought that it was a good idea to have secondees in from industry and vice versa, so they could see what was happening on the proverbial coalface and vice versa. Now, obviously, that's not something that works for all, but that's kind of a nice example of innovative practice. There was other regulators, had masses of data that could use this kind of modern practice of trawling the kind of big data. There were other regulators that didn't. So, and I think there was a lesson that kind of came from all regulators was something good to do was just kind of regular, be it formal or informal, kind of conversations with all the actors within the regime to make sure you have an understanding of what's going on.
So how can one bring in these actors, these third parties, you know, the poor regulator always having to look for emerging risks. So is there
a good, I suppose, good regulatory forums such as this, or, you know, at a kind of industry level kind of regular consultation. It can be informal discussions with inspectors, or you know, whichever kind of enforcement approach you use. It can be setting up kind of anonymous systems for reporting on your website, or various other tools, or speak to your contact centres. I think one of the kind of key things that emerged was it's essential to kind of have a effective system in place to make sure that communication made it through to you know, the necessary people in the regulatory body and wasn't just lost somewhere along the line.
Alex, thank you very, very much.
No, thank you for having me.